Chapter 4. While the police searched the property, Doreen searched the kitchen in vain for a tea kettle. The police had been here for what seemed like hours, and she needed the comfort of a hot cup of tea. After hunting through the cupboards, she had only found a well-stocked pantry, confirming Nan had lived off canned goods. There were canned beans, canned soup, and canned fish. Doreen saw what appeared to be canned potatoes. She stared at it, shuddered, and closed the cupboard quickly. Did Nan have any teeth left? Maybe that was the problem. Doreen knew Nan was a big tea drinker, but Doreen couldn't find any kettle to plug into an outlet. When she opened another cupboard, she found an old-fashioned stovetop kettle. The trouble was, Doreen and stoves didn't get along. Then, of course, she hadn't had much of a relationship with one either. She never had to cook during her entire marriage, and she'd never cooked growing up either. Now that she was single and on her own, she had yet to fathom the depths of how that whole producing wonderful food thing worked. But if there was ever a time to force herself to try, it was now. Because above all else, she desperately wanted a cup of tea. That was, if a double-shot no-fat latte or a latte with sprinkled cinnamon on top wasn't available. And considering her current lack of finances, those fancy coffees would likely never be available to her again. She pulled out the funky-looking kettle, clicked the button at the top to open the lid, and filled it with water from the sink. She walked over to the ancient stove and put the kettle atop one of the rings. She studied the stove for a long moment, but, for the life of her, she didn't know which knob would turn on the right-hand burner in the front. Age had taken its toll on the stove, wearing off all helpful markings, the same as the rest of the house had aged. She would just have to experiment. She turned on both knobs on the right side where she'd put the kettle. Surely this was intuitive. Unfortunately, the smell of gas immediately hit her nose. She shut off both knobs and turned on the other two on the far left side. When she smelled gas again, she quickly turned off those. Back to one of the cupboards again, she pulled out a couple teacups to peer farther inside, then grinned. She reached far back into the cupboard and pulled out a bright and shiny electric kettle. Nan might not have liked it or used it, but Doreen was thrilled. She filled it with water and plugged it in. Now we're in business. For Nan and Doreen, tea time was a beloved hobby. Yet no teapots were visible. At least none that she'd found. But there were teacups. She took out a large one, then found a drawer full of different tea bags and tins full of loose tea leaves. Studying the varieties, she was astonished at their names, like chamomile tea and dandelion leaf tea. Why would anybody want to put hot water on top of dandelion leaves? Dandelions were considered weeds, the bane of her husband's gardeners. She just didn't get it. But she spied a box of black tea bags, and she figured that was her best option. She dropped one into the teacup and waited for the water to boil. Leaning against the sink, her back to the window, she deliberately didn't want to look out the window because police officers crawled all over the property. That lovely bone came from somewhere. As she'd found out on her drive into town earlier this morning, Kelowna was smallish, and the mission area was tiny. Thus the Kelowna RCMP detachment had only 10 full-time staff, as Chester had shared. She swore they were all here in her backyard. Surely they'd be done soon. The property wasn't that large. But she was afraid that if she went outside, with her luck, she'd be the one to find the body. Raising even more suspicions from Arnold and Chester. Beside her, the tea kettle whistled. She frowned as the little silver lid snapped up and down. She took that to mean the water was boiling. She poured hot water into the teacup. She sniffed the air experimentally above it, and it did smell like tea, regular old-fashioned black tea. Emboldened with that simple success, she opened the back door and stepped onto the veranda. None of the officers were close to her now. She figured it was safe to sit down and watch their shenanigans. Who knew she had such a gruesome curiosity? Plus her feet ached, and she needed to get off them. She was used to wearing high heels all day long but couldn't for some reason here in Nan's house. Maybe it was the uneven floor. She didn't know. Her entire wardrobe was completely unsuited for her new lifestyle. Along with that fact came another: she had no money to change it. And she wouldn't have a clue where to buy everyday jeans. The only jeans she owned had designer labels on them, were skin tight, and didn't wear worth a darn. Whereas everybody she'd seen so far in this town wore blue jeans or leggings that looked durable. That was what she needed. Something she could afford and which would last. She might have to follow Nan's advice and go to the church bazaar and find something secondhand. Just the thought made her shudder. She wasn't snooty or too proud. She just wasn't at that point yet of trying to navigate the process. Wearing other people's hand-me-down clothes made her wonder about the original owner. Who they were. Why they'd discarded the clothes. Had they gained weight? Lost weight? Changed jobs? Speaking of jobs, how much could she expect to earn from a job here in the Mission? Heck, she had no idea what kind of a job she would be suited for. Would anyone want to hire her? Her, a discarded rich man's trophy wife? As she looked down at her Chanel suit, she figured it would probably take a year's wages at whatever new career she found in this small town, just to pay for another one of these. On the other hand, she didn't need any more Chanel suits. She had those already, should they ever be needed on occasion in Lower Mission. Still, it would probably take a year's worth of time for her to no longer worry about whether she was perfectly coiffed, all to avoid getting snarky, nasty remarks from her husband. Only after she fully got away from her marriage did she realize the stress and pain involved in maintaining appearances for his sake. And how his constant criticisms, when she didn't achieve the required level of perfection, were more about him and not so much about her. How her nails had always been the wrong color, her lipstick had always been too bright. Her eyeshadow had never been stylish enough. He said her hair, the last time she had it done, made her look like an old woman. Of course it hadn't made her look old, but in his eyes, he was ready for a younger trophy wife. Well, he had found her in Doreen's divorce lawyer. How was that for irony? One thing Doreen had learned from that mess was to laugh at herself. She knew she was an anomaly. Nobody would feel sorry for her after her years of the rich and lavish lifestyle. But rarely did people see the other side of that lifestyle. How Doreen needed to be perfectly fit, a perfect decoration always. To smile, even though she hated the people her husband brought through the house. And when his hand cupped her butt blatantly in front of others, how hard it was to not turn around and smack him for his lack of respect. She took it because most of the time he was fine. He was worse in front of his peers. When she had first met him, she'd been totally in love with him. That had faded quickly. But by then, she had already been groomed for her role as his wife. Another pretty bauble for him to show off. Never mind that she had a brain. But what about her growth as a person? Nobody ever really cared about that. A decade into her marriage, well, that was a whole different story. She finally woke up to seeing how much she was missing in life. Things she'd never have a chance to experience. She didn't know who she was, what she was, or who she wanted to be. All she knew was what her husband had expected her to be while married to him. But what did she expect to be, to do, to become? Find time to figure that out, idiot, she said out loud but with affection. And you promised to never put yourself down again. She had taken enough of that from her husband. Almost worst was his sister. That woman had hated Doreen. The feeling had been mutual. Doreen had never been allowed to say anything catty or mean to her back then. Of course not. Her dratted husband wouldn't have allowed that. And he'd ruled the roost. Ma'am? Startled, she stood, her tea sloshing, almost spilling on her suit. She walked to the railing to see the younger officer, Chester, standing at the foot of the nearest veranda steps, which led to the uncovered deck in the backyard. Yes. Have you been in the backyard at all? She shook her head. I told you that I just arrived today, around noon, moving into the house. She really wondered why the people in this town didn't understand what she was saying. She was a British Canadian, living in a British Canadian town. It wasn't like she was French Canadian with an accent. Before, she'd lived only a 5-hour drive away in the British properties area of West Vancouver. Yet it seemed she had to keep repeating everything she said 3 or 4 times since arriving here. I can prove that I drove all the way from Vancouver this morning, she said, if you don't believe me. He gave her a surprised look and shook his head. It's not that I don't believe you. But we found a lot of footprints back here. What? She leaned forward but couldn't see anything where he pointed. She set her teacup on the little table and walked down the veranda steps, using the wobbly railing for support. The old place was falling apart. As soon as she stepped on one of the wooden planks of the deck, it squeaked and groaned under her weight. And she knew for sure that, at 5'7" and 125 pounds, she was not overweight. No matter what her husband said. Shrugging off her husband's insults, she walked toward the officer, now at the far edge of the deck, and noted as he pointed out several footprints in the yard. The area had been roped off to avoid any further contamination of the scene. But those could have been here a long time. Maybe they are Nan's. He looked down at her, his head cocked. You don't have anything to compare them to right now. But they're large, like a man's size 11. Her eyebrows rose. No, not Nan's. Those are big feet. He pointed at his. Mine are a 10. Those footprints are bigger than mine. Maybe they belong to the dead man, she asked, her voice rising in horror. He stopped and stared at her. Do you know who the dead man is? She frowned. No. Be patient, Doreen. Remember. I just got here. Man, she wanted to put that sentence into audio format and just hit the rewind and play buttons. It would save her a lot of time and effort. But Chester still stared at her as if he couldn't figure out what made her tick. Good luck with that. How could he know when she didn't? Finally, he shook his head and said, no sign of a body yet. Well, unless somebody is walking around town with an amputated finger and just accidentally left the appendage here on my property, I suggest you keep looking. She glanced at her heels and said, I could change my shoes and come out to look too. No, just stay where you are. The less people out here, the better. She chuckled and looked at the dozen people already on her property. What possible difference could one more person make? We're all professionals, ma'am. We know what we're doing. It doesn't look like you do, when you haven't found the body yet, she said in exasperation. She held up her hand to stop him from speaking. Okay, fine. I'll go sit on the veranda. She delicately made her way to the steps. Before she reached them, she turned to Chester and asked, Did you check under the deck? He instantly spun to address her. Why would I check under the deck? She stared at him wordlessly for a full moment, getting a grip on her frustration. Because it's a possible hiding place to put a body? From the doubtful look on his face, she didn't think she would get any kind of a meeting of the minds here. Of course it's a great hiding place. I just thought maybe you knew that's where the body was. Let me tell you one more time. I haven't been in this house in years, until I arrived about noon today from Vancouver. I don't know who the man is who belongs to that finger. In the 3 hours or so that I've spent here today, the last 2 hours of which I have had policemen crawling all over my property, I never saw anybody else in this place, and I did not put a dead body under the deck." On that note, she turned away, gingerly went up the steps, retrieved her tea, and stalked into the house. Her last act of revenge was to slam the door hard.